We're here in Glebe, and I'm talking today to Dr. David McNeill from the College of Fine Arts, University of New South Wales, to Dr. Tim Gregory, now at Curtin University in Perth, and Dr. Urosh Chivoro at the Australian Catholic University. So we're going to be talking today about 2012. What happened? What happened? Okay. So,
David, what happened?
David.
Well, it's hard to remember when things like the Arab Spring happened, but it was 2012. It was early on. The massive change in global politics that in some sense was the washout, I suppose, of 2008, and the chronic and undeniable failure of neoliberal phase of capitalism, and all of the changes in its wake, including, I suppose, with the highest profile, things like the Occupy movement, which had actually started in 2011. It would be naive to imagine that they wouldn't have affected the art world in some way, especially since in that decade leading up to 2008, that the art world had become very closely associated with neoliberal ruling elites, where art had become very much a high-end luxury goods, and artists were competing hand over fist to sell works to people like Dasha Abramovich and Saatchi and so on, and the art journals were listing collectors as among the top 10 most influential people in the art world. It would not have happened 20, 30 years prior to that, and that whole massive edifice, I think, crumbled in the wake of 2008, but that long shadow that 2008 cast certainly fell over 2012, and we're still living in that shadow.
Do you think it crumbled though? Because to me, I still see, I don't know whether this is just Sydney, but to me, I still see in Sydney it's very much about the market, about dealers, about, in fact, consultants for dealers.
No, it is. They're just recording lower profits. I read somewhere that Shark Guy,
Sam Damien
Hirst, he recorded massive losses to his sales. Something in the vicinity of 80%. Which is,
does he cope?
How does he cope? I think that's a very good indication.
He's moved from sharks to salmon.
Nemo. He's going to do that.
Sharks to whitebait.
To shark bait,
But he's a lovely example, because his relationship with his dealers, with Jay Joplin and the New York dealer, crumbled almost exactly as 2008 hit. And he tried to go independent and cut the dealers out, hit the primary market through Sotheby's, and the fallout from that has still decimated the infrastructure of the global art world. The old deal whereby dealers looked after the primary market, auction houses looked after the secondary markets, artists paid a percentage of the profit to those people to do that work for them. That one move of Hirst, in a way, was an anticipation, I think, of what was fundamentally and basically rotten with that whole global art world structure.
Do you think, he had a show at the Tate last year, in which, it wasn't actually part of the retrospective show, but For the Love of God was on display for at least the first part of that exhibition. Do you think that exhibition is in some way trying to recover something of his place and, look into the future, his legacy of...
Well, I think with Hirst is an interesting case study, particularly for the Love of God, because I think what you're seeing there was the move as artist, as venture capitalist, and what David's saying, I think, is quite correct. In that, I remember someone telling me that, it's such a shame that now that, the working class can fly, so airports and flying is no longer that upper class pursuit. I never spoke to him again, obviously.
What sort of people do you hang out with that say things like that?
Well, this is my house in Glebe, so there's lots of them around, unfortunately.
Tim's taking his bow tie off.
It was me. I said it. Okay. But no, I think that what's happened to the art world and what Damien...
but they stick to economy, though, right?
That's
where they belong.
Often now there is only economy, unfortunately. But I think what Hirst did was he pulled the blanket off that kind of facade of art as the polite thing where you don't go and screw the auction house, you don't go and screw your dealer, and he went straight to the market. And I think what he was doing was, in For the Love of God and works like that, kind of showing that kind of raw capitalist product.
Yeah, it was
that
being a
art
great neoliberal. That's what
being
it was
great
doing.
at the exact time when neoliberalism was under attack in 2008.
And
So I don't think he
using
failed.
blood
He just
diamonds
failed
from
at the
Sierra
wrong time.
Leone,
Correct.
and using them to figure a skull. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
it's not a supple work.
No, not at all. And it was always that distance. The artist had to have distance to, or at least perform distance to the art market. And he removed that by saying, I know art and I know capital. And I'm going to do both.
He had the 80s showmanship of I am just shameless, I'm going to go overboard, but he combined it with this sort of ruthless sensibility of I'm going to tap into the market. But the irony is that he got there too late. You know,
He got there
joined
too
the
late.
party
Yeah,
too
yeah.
late.
Well, it corresponded with 2008 and the
Yeah.
collapse. And it's curious, the work he did after that, which were the paintings, where he said, I'm going to go back and do my own paintings, instead of having an army to do the spin paintings. He did those homages to Francis Bacon. Every review of those paintings, when they were shown, said, oh, they're really weak, he's gone off the boil, his career is effectively over. Now, maybe that's true, and they're not very good works, but it could also, because of the damage he did to the structure of the art world, meant that the art world were going to
Gunning
spank
for
him for it.
Yeah, he's burnt
And
bridges.
he did get spanked.
I did see his, when I was in London last year, I saw his exhibition at White Cube in Bermondsey, and, you know, those paintings, I mean,
They're not great.
they're not
They're
great.
not great. But the retrospective of
They're
the
not
tape
sharp.
was fantastic.
Oh, the retrospective was brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, and it had the right kind of amount of gimmickry. I mean, you expect to see, of course, you know, the impossibility in the mind of someone living, etc. Those kinds of big ticket sort of works. But I thought also the butterfly house kind of room was really kind of the gimmick piece in that retrospective.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, I saw a show which might also have been White Cube of Murakami's work. No, it wasn't. It might have been Gagosian. And Murakami, of course, made his reputation during these buoyant years doing fairly flippant anime and manga reference works in very, very bright colours. Not heavy works, and working as a designer for Louis Vuitton and so on. And this was the first exhibition he'd had in Europe after the tsunami in Japan. And I was very, very curious to see how, if at all, he would respond to that, because it would be so difficult for an artist that had produced the sort of work he'd produced to then come to terms at all with that major catastrophe that had hit the whole of Japan. And what he did, and I felt it was a bit lame, is he did brightly coloured stacks, paintings, huge stacks of skulls, brightly coloured day-glow skulls. You can understand in the wake of a trauma it's very hard to know how to respond, but it was almost like a stammer. Like, what can I do? And what we got was the pile of skulls.
I guess the other thing you can say about 2012 is that the first decade was definitely marked by anti-war work, sometimes quite strong, sometimes quite didactic. But I felt we went to document it together, and I think we both felt that there was a lack of unitary vision or a lack of direction in that show, in a sort of critique that was heading in any sense, which is a stark difference to documenters in previous years, some of which were landmark exhibitions, where this one was individual works were fantastic in their own right, but overall one just had no sense of a curatorial vision or a direction for such a what really is one of the high points in a year, really, I think, in
So
terms
why?
of international exhibition.
I mean, why? I mean, some people are saying it's it's the GFC documenter. That it was just sort of a mixture of past documenters put up as almost like a retrospective. But why do we think that this one was, when there was so much, as Dave, you were saying, so much interesting political stuff, Occupy movement was on, it was the year that Pussy Riot was put in jail, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Why didn't Documenta key into that? I mean, I would have thought they would have, as they did in 2001.
I think it's a curatorial failure. I don't think it necessarily reflects on the art, as you're suggesting, that is around at the time. But it's curious that very same director was named the most influential person in the art world in that infamous art review top 100. And the reviews in the mainstream journals of that documenta were glowing. So it suggests that there's an audience out there for contemporary art that doesn't want difficulty, doesn't want awkward thematics, doesn't want art that gets down and dirty in any kind of way at all, but still pines for the days of high-end luxury.
But I wonder if it's even possible, because the sense that I got from it as well, likewise, was that there wasn't it wasn't a clear kind of curatorial vision there at all. But you get together literally hundreds of artists there was, I think, in the Fridusianum, in that dome room, the round room there was an interesting thing that was happening with some, 6,000-year-old pieces of, clay works, and, the Lee Miller pictures of, her in Hitler's bath and that kind of stuff. There was something quite interesting happening in that room, but it was almost as if, okay, this is my curatorial vision in this little kind of ground zero, and then the rest of it is really a satellite to that.
No, the curatorial vision was in the letters dedicated to her.
Yeah, now we all had different responses to. Well, actually, no, we all had very similar responses to the wind installation. To me, I think that these things necessarily are problematic because we do expect some sort of coherent message to come through them, but is that always a falsity if it is there, because it's such a large, supposedly 5-year survey show, really.
I always thought that yes, they are huge survey shows, and in that sense they can never gel completely, but I always felt that in times where there's a clear ideological orientation of the world, whether we like it or not, as in the West versus Islam that marked the previous decade, it's easier for any critical project to orient itself towards it, because we're now in times where there isn't a clear ideological sense of, there is a sense of brooding anti-capitalism, but I don't think it's sort of solidified as yet sufficiently, or maybe the art world doesn't want to touch it. So I felt that was what marked. I mean, even with Venice the year before, I mean, we talked about this, that it was the first time where individual works overshadowed the pavilions.
Yeah.
Well, again, you have like a brilliance of, a particular artist that might be doing great work, but overall, there isn't a vision.
It probably has to be said that in the art world, if you're looking for evidence of engaged art and progressive art, probably the Venice Biennale and Documenta finally are not going to be the places to look for it.
True.
Although, as you said, previous documenters did do that. Bruegel and Noax was a brilliant one. Okwei was Katarina David before that. They have actually been very, very engaged and very intelligent art exhibitions for grown-ups, as opposed to the lolly shop exhibitions that we see in Sydney.
And perhaps a counterexample would be the Manifesta, which was really, really well done.
Wonderful show on the death of industrial labour. Yeah.
Do you think that it has become, because this I think ties in with those issues to do with the market, do you think it has become a bit of a merry-go-round for the same names that you see in the same exhibitions time and time again?
Well, that's been the case for a while, hasn't it? I mean, certainly with those sort of survey shows. I think what the exponential explosion of biennales across the world would indicate that it is a bit of a sort of tourist gimmick on the whole. And so, I think that in as much as the Sydney fireworks produce, was it a winking eye or kissing lips? Yes, I mean, who makes those kind of decisions? The reason those decisions are made is because you get the one tourist shot and it's worth its weight in gold. If you look at the Sydney Biennale, which also happened last year, which may not make the list of things that were interesting last year, but it was the same kind of thing where you have to parachute in some big work that that does the right kind of has the right kind of impact on the right kind of process. So I think biennales will always suffer from that, and I don't really know what the answer is to that, other than to suggest that maybe there are works under that will fulfill that purpose.
I think that's one possibility, that world we're looking at, the world that's written up in Frieze magazine and Parquet, the world of the biennales, the world of local wealthy gallery dealers in Sydney, for example, in microcosm, that increasingly that's a world that's shrinking and becoming isolated. And when increasingly, I think younger people, when they think about visual culture or think about art these days, that's the last thing they think about. They think about street art, or they think about what's going on online. There are whole different universes with which that old world is in competition.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, because all four of us are educators, we're all in the tertiary education system, and I just find that there is I mean, there are other more complex issues here, I suppose, but there is a kind of disconnection that my students have with things like even the Sydney Biennale, which is for my students in Newcastle only 2.5 hours down the road. It makes me wonder that if what are our students interested in? What are our students kind of focusing on? are those things different from what we're seeing in those bigger shows of established artists?
I would say yes, definitely.
And even to get a purchase on that, you've got to first of all make that leap from fine arts to visual culture.
That's right.
If you don't make that leap, if you're still living in a world of high art, which is privileged and more sophisticated
Separate
than
from,
popular culture,
Yeah.
You're never going to get out of that little bubble world.
And besides, I think that distinction, when you do sort of, even if you want to try to argue that distinction to the students, they just don't see it. It's just non-existent.
Well, I think what we're also looking at is that now what's hit universities is digital natives. Like we now are teaching students that grew up entirely online.
Yeah.
So there is no distinction between them. I mean, teaching in painting in studio, the students that were showing me their work on their iPhone, which I had no problem with, but I certainly know some of the other lecturers thought this was abominable. How could you possibly use an iPhone in a painting studio? But it just simply wasn't for students. There is no distinction between those two things. And to see the Biennale, why spend 2 hours coming down to Sydney when you can look at it online?
Yeah.
True.
And for a lot of those works, I think, and the interesting works, I think that's true.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. I mean, this occurred to me last year that the school leavers that were coming through were born in 1993, which is the year that the World Wide Web came into existence.
Yeah.
And I think for those students, it's like the television was for us. The telephone. It's just a technology that's part of the landscape.
Yes. So all these discussions of distinctions between the online and the real, they're just something.
Well, it's older academics like us that are having that debate. I think that debate's over. And I think the real debate now is more about, in terms of education at least, like what universities are doing. And people are not turning up to biennales anymore. Certainly young people interested in visual culture. Then they're also not going to necessarily be turning up to universities to learn about visual culture. I mean, I even get, iTunes U has changed my life. I can just listen to the lectures that happened yesterday from Harvard. They put them all online for free now. I mean, that's a radical shift that's occurring.
Well, this kind of leads us on to an interesting thing, just in terms of, like I said, the thing we all share, which is working in universities. It's changed so much in the relatively short space of time that I've been teaching. We no longer actually require attendance. We can't require attendance.
It's not a
mental or otherwise.
It used to be the case that you would have to, attend 80% of the time to be eligible for assessment, but we've had to take that out of all of our course outlines.
Wow.
So
Not
the very
yet with you?
nature of what we're
Not
actually
yet with
doing
us,
is
I think.
something completely
No,
different.
I certainly don't do that because I'm old school. But I realise that, I'm the dinosaur. But I like biennales and the high art as well. I like going to those sort of things. But I've got no illusions that what I liked and what I was trained to enjoy is relevant to the 21st century, and that would include things like proximate teaching, because clearly teaching in 10, 15 years is not going to be the seminar, the tutorial, the stand-up lecture. I mean, it will die.
And so taking that out, is that under the rationale that they would be doing the learning elsewhere? That's not, obviously it wouldn't be saying that they're just not doing it. The rationale would be that because these students are doing their learning but in accessing the information in other ways.
The way I see it, and I'm trying to roll with this as opposed to kind of work against it, I think, but the way in what I do with my own teaching, the way that I'm seeing it now is that what we produce as educators is more a contribution to almost like a common treasury of information and ideas that are out there that people can access and be made available. And doing this Studio Crash thing is kind of part of that approach. And it's almost like what we do in university, what we're paid to do in university, is assess and accredit. That's what it's coming down to, rather than the old way that we're there to kind of teach. And I'm somebody, I think all of us actually enjoy teaching, which is a rarity amongst academia, I think. But I enjoy teaching, but I think that I feel like almost I'm having to make myself go beyond just that classroom approach.
And I think maybe 2012 is another interesting issue, maybe it's a meta issue for me, with this coming online teaching, and as you say, the language around it is about freedom of knowledge, sharing knowledge across universities. There is still a distinction between our research output, which is owned intellectual property by the university. There's still that issue that hasn't been solved yet. It's not the Julian Assange kind of free information for everyone state that we're in. The other thing is that a lot of universities, and I'm pretty sure UNSW is doing this, have moved to cloud computing. They don't have servers on site anymore, and there are some significant issues around that, because whenever you hear the term like cloud, you know you need to run them under 100 miles. It's not cloud, it's massive banks
it's centralization.
of data. It's centralization. Not only is it centralization, it's centralization largely in America. And if data is stored on American soil, it is subject to the Patriot Act. So for instance, all our students' results, which are being stored on cloud servers, are actually subject to the Patriot Act.
Which is interesting when you think technologies like Turnitin, which we just routinely use for everything handed in now, and we had to because plagiarism was becoming such a huge problem.
Yeah.
I'm gathering that the Turnitin servers are probably based in America.
As well, yeah.
But
And
that's not enforced yet, Turnitin. That's just you use it if you want to, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, really, except for some exceptions that where students are responding to a show that's on right now, something like that, I generally require it because the plagiarism issue was so bad.
Yeah, because they are the internet generation. Copy and paste is not a
Yeah.
problem. It's not an issue.
But that's why I think that you need to make what we assess them on as well different from. It can't be about data retrieval anymore. It can't be about go and bring this information back. We have to actually force them to do things that are about actually constructing knowledge, because it doesn't work otherwise. I don't know how many class presentations I've sat through. I remember there was one actually where I wouldn't say what class it was, but there was one where I thought this sounds very sophisticated for a first year student, and while the student was talking I actually googled a very idiosyncratic sentence, and there it was, came up on the Wikipedia site for that particular topic, and I thought, no, this is it, this is the death of pre-prepared class presentation. We can't do that anymore.
Yeah, and I think any defence against that will always be rearguard. And I don't know if it's a fair analogy, but I think early last year was the moment of the mega upload bust, or maybe it was
around there,
2011. And the mega upload bust was extraordinary, because if you went to the site after the guy was arrested by the FBI in New Zealand, all you got was a strange little certificate from the FBI saying, you're facing prosecution if you proceed on this site. And it's the old story of what Marx said about capitalism, that as the means of production, the means of knowledge production, become revolutionised, the old social relations of production, which under capitalism is always inflexibly private ownership, are under pressure. And they crack, and capitalism always fights back, but eventually it's probably a losing battle.
It already is. He's back.
Yeah,
he's back.
Dotcom's back.
It's launched, I think, yesterday or day
Yeah, I
before.
believe.
We saw how quickly file serving got around those issues.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was 6 months when Rapid Share was taking things down and things like that, but then torrent sharing came in. The technology just doesn't allow itself to be tied down in that kind of way, and that's probably true of education too.
That's why I think it's got to be a more open source approach. With the production of what we do, it has to be much
There's
more
push
open
for
source.
that, even for research.
Yeah.
All the research output is going to be open source. That they're going to do away completely with journals, paper-based journals. That it's not only going to be online, but no subscription.
But it takes a very I think it takes a very bold and forward-looking attitude of universities to let go. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric around this within universities at the kind of upper levels of when people talk about things like MOOCs and that kind of stuff. But I think that it really kind of needs a real bold approach by universities to actually let go of trying to keep their mitts on the intellectual property.
I agree, but I also think it's going to be a case like the CD or music industry, where the people who won't want to let go are going to be the Ivy League kind of universities, obviously. But the people that don't have a reputation to lose are going to be the ones that do it. And they're going to take over very, very quickly.
It's going to be a red.
I think it was Harvard who did the MOOC idea first, I think, was it?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah. But it's also interesting. I mean, around that whole issue of the internet, is that Mackenzie Wack is the author of the Hackers Manifesto, Australian actually. It was 2012 and he announced the death of the internet. As far as he's concerned, that while we are all talking about open source and all the rest of it, there has been a death of the internet where you have seen capitalism actually take over a large proportion of what we were thinking for the last 10 years was free, free music, free movies, that kind of stuff. It is starting to be shut down. And his argument actually is that there is a new area of freedom that's just being explored, which is in the realm, back in the physical world, the realm of 3D printers.
Yeah.
And he's saying they're now at the cost that you can get one, you can buy one for about $300.
Yeah.
And so the intellectual property is about the code of actual physical items which you can print at home. So you can print your own designer teacup or shirt or whatever that's identical to a real designer one. There's a whole issue now that's moving back into the real world that I think we will be seeing in the next few years as well.
And in a way, it's been anticipated at almost a craft level by Chinese economic expansion. Because though the Chinese did sign an international copyright agreement in the early 90s, there is so much what an American capitalist would call copyright intellectual property violation in China, that it's hard to imagine the Chinese economy and that annual 9% growth of GNP and so on happening without systematic violations of, or not violations, but a different attitude to what owning an idea constitutes. And how it should be acknowledged.
Just to go back also to specifically the art world as well, and just thinking of China, do you think that we are seeing what was sort of predicted, I suppose, from the 90s onwards, this idea that China is now the predominant force in contemporary art?
In retrospect, 2008 might be seen to have killed that too.
That entire logic.
Of the new realm. Prior to 2008, everyone was gearing up for the subcontinent. It was going to be contemporary Indian and contemporary Pakistani. It was going to be the next best thing to follow on from China, which had followed on from Africa, which had followed on from the former Soviet bloc countries, as the new world that the global art machine could exploit and mine. And that didn't happen, of course. 2008 stopped that burgeoning of Indian contemporary art. But the Chinese market also slumped. And these things are relative. There's still a lot of Chinese art sold and shown globally, but nothing like what there was. It was 2007, for example. It's changed.
In many ways, it's a transition period between that mindset and whatever is on the horizon, which we really don't know or cannot anticipate at the moment.
What would you venture to predict?
Where to invest the money?
Insider's tip.
Very collectors out there.
Actually, my work is
bunch of
going
lefties
quite
sitting
cheap.
there giving advice to.
Buy Tim Gregory. He's going to be really
Just
hot.
hold your breath while he finishes the work.
Oh, shut up. It's coming. Your giant self-portrait is coming.
Good.
But I mean, in terms of the China question, are we also looking at the question, or the Ai Weiwei question, if you like? The one thing that you apparently, I was told, if you're ever at an ARI opening and don't know anyone, just go up to someone and ask, "So have you heard about Ai Weiwei?" That's just a question to start any conversation. But is it about that moment when we saw the Arab Spring of China coming in, and Ai Weiwei was a guy we all know about, but arresting whatever it was, 2,000-3,000 artists? Was that the moment at which China was saying, we're happy to produce art for the art market, but there are limits on what we're willing to let go?
But China's been saying that consistently, right through the 80s, into the 90s, and into the noughties as well. I mean, the problem is, how do you produce a consumer society, and to some extent a class society, without also buying that other part of the Western ideological structure, which is supposed two-party democracy, however you express it. How do you have the consumerism but not have the same sort of political structures? And one would have to say, so far they've been enormously successful doing just that.
In terms of the Australian art world, one of the big events, for want of a better term, that happened last year was Adam Cullen dying, which I think was not a surprise for many people. I wrote about him, I suppose, in my PhD. So I mean, this is why for me, and David was my PhD supervisor. So this is why, in some ways, I found it quite interesting seeing the trajectory of him as an artist. What are your thoughts on that?
Was it? Well, Kit, you probably have the better answer to this. I know a little bit about him because actually my gallery represented him for a while. Towards the end, and as you said, it was somewhat predictable, unfortunately. But was it just a kind of a farce at the end? I mean, in the sense that he was playing out a narrative that was fairly obvious from the 90s, and the world in which the bad boy artist could be still a semi-abstract expressionist, could do sort of Nazi-esque kind of paintings and get away with it, just wasn't really, I don't know, having the kind of impact that it originally did? Was it just like a midlife crisis sort of look?
And you think it was more of a relic of a particular moment?
Maybe.
Yeah, it did seem like the natural conclusion to a narrative that he was playing out quite actively in his career. I mean, even from the very beginning, people often go on about, that thing about when he was a Kofa and he went around with a pig's head tied to his ankle and that kind of thing. I thought that the really interesting moment in his career was when he won the Archibald.
Yeah.
And I remember he gave a talk at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I went down because I hadn't seen him for a few years, and went down there just to kind of watch. When they had the Q&A session at the end of his talk, I said to him, and I know how it would have sounded awful in retrospect, but I said to him, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" I thought, actually, as a painter, I never thought that much of his work, and I thought that what he was doing through his painting was playing out the not being a brilliant painter.
Yeah.
But there's a limited life.
What was his answer to the question?
Yeah, what was his answer?
Oh, it was very. Had I known he was kind of so much into firearms, I don't think I would have asked him quite in such a shitty way. But he
Terrible aim.
he said, he said something which effective. I think that it's more conservative to
not go to the art gallery.
not be in the Archibald.
He was being the avant-garde in going to the Archibald.
Yeah. So there's a kind of an ironic avant-garde. But
More conservative not to get rich on your art.
That's right. That's right.
I think that I definitely think that there was a moment there within Australian art where there was something. He was part of something that was quite interesting that was happening. And that was in the early '90s. Yeah. I think by the time he'd won the Archibald, something else interesting was happening, but it wasn't about his art.
Yeah.
And like I said,
isn't it also just a continuation of the Australian art market, which for as long as white settlement has just been focused on the white male that sort of is Bushman-esque rebel figure that does kind of poor abstract expression-y kind of, yet still looks like landscape stuff. He was in I think a long line of that that is still continuing today. I mean, if you look at the bestsellers in Australia, they're all white painters, white male painters, so nothing's going to change on that level. And it's hard to think that he was being radical in being conservative. I think that a lot of white male artists do that.
I think he also being an artist which came from that era of YBA / grunge art, for want of a better term, I think is one of few artists who perhaps wasn't as successful as someone like Hirst in cashing in on it to its full extent. He wasn't as much of an entrepreneur, so. But
then there was something very deliberately kind of colloquial or parochial about the kind of voice, about the authorial voice in this work. It was very much Australian. That was what he traded.
I think that was his brand.
Yeah.
But it was just a brand that he could not cash in, perhaps as much as some others have.
Do you think that there is still interesting things happening at that more entry level kind of thing with the artist-run spaces in Sydney? Is that still where you find interesting work?
If you're looking for interesting work, then I think that's still the spot for it in a physical sense. If you're going out there and actually looking at galleries, and it's still, the ARIs are still doing well, and Sydney's still producing some interesting stuff. But I agree with Dave. I still think that what a lot of galleries, including ARIs, are suffering from is, or at least not acknowledging, is the shift right into visual culture where, let's be completely honest, we are now entirely living out the Joseph Beuys everyone's an artist. Every kid has their Facebook page. I know it's a cliche now, but they're curating their own lives, day in, day out. So what makes an artist special? Well, it's a very open question, and when I go to a lot of exhibitions, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a shift that says that the gallery is one site of visual cultural production, and the other site used to be the commercial world. But now you've obviously got the amateur world, which is everyone that is producing stuff that people are liking. Liking images on Facebook is like going to a gallery and say, I like this bit of work. So people are actively engaging. I think there's not a death of an audience of art or of imagery. it's hugely expanded. People are judging images all the time now, but it has just sort of broken down into friend groups or whatever, which is all, let's be entirely honest, the Sydney art scene is. It's a group of friends who are fairly small that go around to
And
art
it's always
events.
been the case, really.
It's always,
Yeah.
of course it has
Yeah.
been.
Except now that they don't have the upper hand in sort of being
They're not the only group that are doing it.
that are doing it and
Yeah.
dealing with those sorts of questions. I mean, it's the old Benjamin idea, the democratization of visual culture, which is fantastic. But it changes. I agree with Tim. It changes the whole landscape. It changes how people view it. It changes how people react to it. It changes how artists make work, I think.
Yeah.
Now, whether we argue that it means homogenization or whether it means diversification, it's an entirely different question. But it's hugely. Tim knows most about it. I know through Tim mainly a little bit about it, but yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you go to those openings and you often have the big question of artist question mark.
One of the big shifts, this is moving it a bit, but I remember during the 90s that the analysis that came out that was critical of neoliberalism tended to have a certain kind of flavour to it. And what it said is that neoliberalism is a misguided theism. It's a kind of religion. Neoliberals believe that there's this thing called the free market, and if untrammelled, if all the handcuffs are taken off it, it will somehow adjust the world in terms of social justice, equal distribution of resources and so on. And the critical text said, yes, but they're wrong about that, and explained why it was wrong, whether it was a Marxist position or any other one. But that literature changed, and it changed immediately in the lead up to 2008, and certainly afterwards, where if you read, David Harvey's book on neoliberalism,
Yep.
or Chappelli, what they're now saying is, no, that's not what it was. That there was actually a strata or fraction of the capitalist ruling class that were not the old industrialists that used to make stuff and used to use that as the rationale for taking more than their share of the resources.
The entrepreneurs.
The entrepreneurs, the makers, the ones that very often would not be into conspicuous consumption. And the collectors, like the steel magnates and the railway tycoons, that wouldn't give a damn if anyone in the world saw their stuff. Alfred Barnes is a good example. He locked his Matisses up in his house and wouldn't let people in to look at them. When they died, they'd leave them to a gallery. But they weren't interested in that artwork that they collected somehow reflecting on them, because they didn't need to manipulate their image. But the generation of neoliberal collectors that emerges through the 80s and into the 90s are part of the renegade neoliberalist ones who work in the service sector, advertising, high-end luxury goods, Arnault and Pinot, people like that, Saatchi's. And they're very much into conspicuous consumption. That neoliberal, that finance capital strata of capitalists, they didn't have any compunction at all about conspicuous consumption. They wanted to take as much money as they could, didn't want to put it back into R&D, wanted to accumulate, wanted to buy bigger and bigger yachts, private jets, and finally, like Abramovich and his wife Dasha, they needed to buy art. Versace needed to buy. In a sense, that was his R&D for advertising, but there was a generation of collectors that needed to open their own galleries, like the enormous Pinot Gallery in Venice, and needed to use art to advertise what it was they did in the world and their presence and who they were. And David Harvey and others will simply call them gangsters, because they were appropriating money that wasn't theirs to appropriate, and they were consuming more than anyone ever has the right to consume. And a lot of artists played along with that game because it was a very, very seductive game. You'd like to travel with Dasha on her yacht to Venice, to be flown around the world to vernissages, different biennales and so on, and to design handbags for fashion companies. And that's what a lot of artists ended up doing. And some of them are very good artists. That's not a reflection of how good or bad their art is. But there was this kind of agreed kind of assumption that art, design and fashion at the highest end kind of go together. So artists do art cars, paint BMWs and things like that. One would not imagine that happening in the 1950s.
Or
it happened all the way through the 90s.
Or since, if you think about, from the 1960s, if you did engage in those kinds of activities, there was always a reading of that, which was that it was a critique.
Yes. Which still exists. People
do you think there's any
play the irony
truth in this idea that critique is dead? That artists, there's something old hat about like a social critique that exists within art discourse, within the production of art?
I think a perception or a certain kind of perception of what critique art is supposed to be doing might be dead, not the critique of art itself. I think there's a lot of art that is still critical, but we need to go beyond, I guess you can call it a view whereby art stands on the sideline or the margin of society and looks back and casts a sort of critical vision. I think that view is gone, bearing in mind what many of us said, I mean, you know, with Tim and visual culture and so forth. I think that we need to rethink entirely this idea of, yes, art is critical, that I accept that, but the way in which it is critical. I think we haven't, maybe a changing paradigm, you can call it, in the way in which art is now part of visual culture, and as such can no longer claim to have this sort of exclusive access to critique that other avenues may not have. I mean, I agree that there's a blurring between art and design, and in many ways that's in debt to capitalism, or a certain kind of capitalism. But in another sense, I think it's liberating. I mean, why should art be more valued than design, and that there's you know, a lot that can happen between their meetings. So in other words, I think art is still critical. We need to catch up with it. So it's not what can art do for us, what can we do to meet it.
And I also think that what I'm kind of, I haven't made up my mind about this yet, but certainly what you're seeing in a lot of universities and a lot of artists are talking about is this massive return of situationism. It's just everywhere. People are talking about Derives and Deformment, and I mean, Pussy Riot released a song that was Under the Cobblestones. You know, it's rife with that. And I think that maybe is the way that a lot of artists are thinking about this question of critique. That the city is the canvas, that you can't, as George said, you can't stand outside of it and then do your critique, the postmodern kind of intellectual critique. You have to be in it, you have to be participating in it, and you've got to risk something in order to produce the critique itself. And perhaps the best art for the last year has been doing that.
It's interesting because from an art historical perspective, situationism really is, the way I always think about it is that it's part of a kind of a, you know, of a neo-Dadaism that Fluxus belongs to as well, that re-emerges in the 1960s from, you know, after the First World War. And I think it's interesting then that we're starting to see that it's almost as though we get moments of crisis where people go, this is bullshit, and they go back to Dada.
Rejection. I mean, you know, we have art that encourages participation, art that encourages where audience is effectively the subject of the work. I mean, many of these,
a lot of lame artwork was produced under that.
There's a lot. No, absolutely, that has to be said. But I think that idea as a whole, I think, is retro in many ways. It's sort of reinventing an old strategy, but it's clearly a reaction in, you know, Occupy and so forth. But I think it says something about the shrinking of the social sphere which we are experiencing and how people are responding, I think.
And actually, speaking on that, just to bring it back to Australia again and the Sydney Biennale, there was one work in that which I think sort of sums up this kind of movement, because relational aesthetics unfortunately doesn't seem to be going away. It's still there, and I think Boris Groys's critique on it's really nice. It's sort of a forced democracy under the rules of the artist. That says you're the author, but I'm the author, and you must do exactly what I say, but you're doing it. There's a lot of problems with it, and I think at the base of it was that notion of convivial, that you're kind of producing a community. There was a typical work like that. I think it was by Tiffany Singh in the Sydney Biennale, which were these wind chimes, and you could take one, you could paint them, and then it goes back to the Cockatoo Island and gets hung there. But the day that I went, I thought it was a perfect illustration of one of the issues with this, which was that the whole work was about this sort of Zen Buddhist sort of nature, harmony, everything in order, this kind of stuff, humans and nature, the day I went, it was incredibly windy, so windy in fact that the wind chimes shattered, they broke, and you know, the invigilators were really distressed by this, blah blah. But I thought it sounded a hell of a lot better. You had these kind of broken wind chimes that were rolling around. And to me, it was...
And a beautiful indeterminate kind of random element introduced into the work.
Exactly.
Accident.
Exactly. And it was just one of those things where nature didn't participate in the way the artist wanted nature to. Like, you can force audience members, invigilators, not to let the 5-year-old in to pull it down, but you can't stop nature doing that.
And I think fought back.
And I know we don't like talking about this, and for good reason, but that one of the other trends we haven't mentioned is eco art.
You know,
and it's right here we had the hottest day on record, la la la, a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I just think back to that work where it's like, yeah, eco art, one of the problems is that it is drawing a lot from relational aesthetics and assuming this sort of harmony. Whereas in fact, of course, nature doesn't give a fuck about art. And it will just destroy an artwork if it chooses to. Well, not even, obviously
And nature
it
is
doesn't choose.
series of accidents.
It's just going to do it. It just does it.
Or a country, in the case of Japan.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean,
Or
art-
Indonesia in 2004.
yeah. So art can't work with nature in that kind of way. It can't use it as a collaborator, not in that sort of relational way, in the way that it can use humans.
So ecology is the death
co-author.
of relational aesthetics.
Oh, hopefully. Hopefully. You can't keep the wind out.
To return to that point about the collaboration between artists and neoliberalism,
Yeah.
I mean, and the role of irony in that. If you do it, can you claim that through your art you're exposing the fundamental contradiction? It's a strategy that Euros knows very well, because it's Zizek's over-identification, which is based on a Lacanian notion, where you become more fascist than the fascist in your work, like Irwin's passports, Leibuscher's national anthems, the guy that filled the synagogue with gas in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
I've forgotten his name. I should have. Sebastian Santiago and people like that. And I think it can work as a strategy, but it's got to be quite clear that it's caricature and travesty. I think you can't use that kind of strategy as a lazy way of justifying the prices you get in the market.
Yes.
Although in a way you can say, I mean, going back to someone like Warhol, that the lack of clarity as to, the two readings of Warhol, whether he was, I think it was Thomas Crowe wrote about him being obsessed with death, and there's, all other alternative readings to Warhol that problematized the certainty of that he was making some ironic statement about capitalism and consumerism in the 1960s and 70s.
Didn't read true.
No, and still doesn't. No, I agree. You have to. There can be no pretense that, yes, somehow I am being critical of this, even though I always think of Santiago Sierra. In Sierra, there isn't that. His work is uncomfortable. And that to me is a very good example of that over-identification.
And that's when it works.
That's when it works.
Yeah.
That's exactly when it works.
I guess then you
And
have
when it's probably hard to collect.
Yes, which would be part of why it works, I think.
But that's going back to the market thing. This is the interesting thing. I think having kind of last year on a particular occasion sort of mingled with particular social occasion, mingled with a bunch of collectors.
Really?
How they
God, stop.
Good for you, darling.
It was a party I got invited.
Delightful.
He's sitting on the far left too, which is obviously not right.
Or the far right, depending on which way you're looking at it. I was. The interesting thing was that it occurred to me that talking to the collectors that there needed to be almost like a soundbite understanding of the artwork that they were buying, even if it was in fact ironically about consumerism, etc. But there had to be a soundbite understanding. Difficult work because it involves, if difficult work involves a kind of a deeper understanding of art history or any kind of other larger sort of structure of understanding, you can't convey that in a soundbite. So I think that
I don't know. I
it
think
resists collection in a way.
It does resist collection, but I still think it does kind of come back to, is there an object to collect? I mean, you can reduce difficult concepts down to something that a brand that you can then sell, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
if it looks good, not even bother with the concept.
Exactly.
It looks
So
good.
I think there is that issue. And you look at artists like Hornsleth. I think he kind of sits right on the line there, because I'm thinking of like his Arms Investment Corporation, where he sold shares in an arms investment corporation, which only traded in weapons, and you could buy shares, and that was the artwork. But then he had this catch-22 where he would donate all the money he got from the company into charities that dealt with victims of war.
Yeah.
So he created this beautiful loop, this completely closed work that was, you could collect it, you would get the paper that was the share.
Yeah.
But then the money itself was used to try and solve the problem that it was creating. So I think that was a really nice kind of meta image for that idea of charity as a whole, but also capitalism, which is it's going to create the problem that you then seek to solve.
I think
And
it looks like
interestingly-
that is there in her skull work too.
I think
Yes,
so too.
yes,
I think so
yes,
too.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also insinuating the collector as well on the
Exactly.
the
closeness.
perpetrators.
Exactly.
Kind of like,
yeah. Exactly.
Well, we do know if you go to those very, very high-profile art galleries opened by the neoliberal private collectors, by Saatchi, by Pino, Arnaud's new one, Garage, Dash's place in Moscow, that the art in them, by and large, almost entirely, is of a certain kind. It's very, very large, it's very spectacular, it's very brightly coloured, and very often it's not conceptually too challenging in the ways that some of this loop art is. So that kind of high-end luxury good art needs to be distinguished, I think, from von Hornslet. So.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Definitely. Although, I mean, as I said, Hornslet kind of sits on the line because he also does, like you said, he did do a car for BMW. So I think that there is these weird lines.
Well, he did a Lamborghini, but it had "Piss on My Grave."
Yes.
painted
It
on
was still that's the interesting thing, and the Rolex watch that says "fuck you up,"
lovers.
which was kind of interesting until they started selling for more than the Rolex is worth.
Yeah, you can imagine
It
somebody,
starts to-
a collector buying it.
exactly. So-
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. I mean, I think yes, a certain kind of collector would be attracted to certain kind of non-threatening, not intimidating works, but I think perhaps there's a new generation of collectors who are quite happy to be offended as long as it fetches a good price, or as long as it's a good investment. No, you don't think so?
It might just mean that art's not offensive enough.
Yeah, they're not truly
yeah, it might,
offended.
yeah,
It's a bit like the old casino sort of scenario that, you can go to the casino and win, but most of the time the house wins.
Yeah. And
Casino
is
wins.
it also that kind of thing that the triumph of capitalism is that it's so successful that you can critique it as much as you like and it's not actually going to be offensive. I mean, I think collectors think that. Or
Yeah.
certain type of collector would think that. You buy the artist that's critiquing capitalism because it shows how strong capitalism is. I'm willing to buy
Yeah.
stuff that critiques it.
Yeah, you know, how many traders
Immediately.
were in the Occupy movement?
Yeah. And it was right outside their offices in most
That's right,
cases because they were in the financial districts in
Yeah.
all of the cities. An example of that would be the painting by Banksy in his LA show a couple of years ago of Brad and Angelina sitting on an umbrella in the Sahara choosing a starving African child to adopt.
Yeah, but we've all done that.
They bought it.
Yeah.
They paid a lot of money for it.
Yeah.
And they moved it to the left wing of the Palladian Villa in London,
Or
where
the
all
right
the
wing.
nannies are looking after the kids.
Yeah, but and
This
so
is
does
how
that-
cool we are. He's telling us to get
Yeah.
stuffed and we love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
I mean, the old
disparage it.
conspiratorial view of capitalism would be, you'd buy it and then you'd lock it up so no one could ever see it.
But you don't even do that, though.
I doubt they did that.
No, I doubt they did that, and I also think that that's a stupid strategy. It's a usual censorship debate. Like, the best way to take the critique out of that is for you to buy
Just to
it.
love it.
Yeah.
hug it.
To love it, and
Yeah.
display it proudly. So I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of art, and what a lot of art struggles with. Because even if you are sincerely an artist that wants to critique the system, as soon as you start getting accepted by the system, it's incredibly hard to resist it and
Yeah.
continue to resist it.
Yeah.
There are only a few artists like, as you're one of your favourite artists, Alexander Brenner, who continue to do that.
Yeah.
And hence they're homeless, stateless, and all the rest of it.
Yes.
So I think, it's very hard to maintain that position.
Particularly since the art world does have a category for the bad boy or bad girl artist.
Yes.
You know, the mischievous one,
Yeah.
the naughty child.
It's amazing that it's such a recurring motif.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
well worn.
Yeah.
And Cullen would have fitted into that.
Yeah,
Yes.
Absolutely. Early career.
But at a broader level, all culture has that. I mean, pop culture is absolutely full of it, and that's almost one of the definitions, I'd say, of culture is that you are experiencing things that you wouldn't do yourself, or don't have the guts to do yourself. It's that slightly outside the social norm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Hollywood producing movies that critique capitalism.
Yeah.
From your Avatar through to a range of other films would say, "Oh, bad corporations are wrecking the world."
Yeah.
Which incidentally also being financed by corporate. That's fine.
Yeah, like a generation of kids are going to grow up as socialists because they saw Avatar.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Painting
Yeah.
himself blue at least.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. At least Smurfs may make a comeback.
Anyway, so this year we've got Venice.
Istanbul, Lyon.
It's going to be
Leon
more
too,
the same.
Yeah. I think, on that, I think one of the really interesting changes that if the 90s was the decade of the burgeoning of being an artist, as the art world went exponentially global, and contemporary art was no longer the preserve of North Atlantic cultures. As it went global, biennales sprung up all over the place. There'd been Sao Paulo since the early 50s, there'd been Havana since the early 80s, but boing, they went everywhere. But the decade, near decade, from 2000 to 2008, was really the decade of the art fair. And that's when places like Cologne and Miami and Basel, all of those art fairs really became very, very high profile. And in a way, they offered the biennales an alibi, because if you have these commercial art fairs, the Frieze Art Fair is the most recent of them, in which dealers unabashedly are setting up their booths, and there's no narrative being told by the work as you move through it, the lolly shop, the smorgasbord approach. If the art fairs are doing that, then the biennales can maintain their kind of high-minded,
safe haven of critique.
Supposedly distanced from the market, because the arts fairs do all that dirty stuff.
I find arts fairs the most incredibly bizarre thing, though, because they seem very much like trade fairs. There is very little. I went to the Armory show a couple of years ago in New York, and it was not all that different from the home renovation show in Newcastle. It was exactly the same setup. There were booths, there were people selling products. It seems to me like it is that they are very much set up for sales.
Yeah, but I think
Big
also
shop.
that the rise of the art fairs was predicated on that boom economy, and I think post 2008, there are art fairs still struggling, and art fairs like Basel will go forever because they're invitation only. If the list gets a bit shorter, you're still getting enough gallery dealers in. But some of them have struggled. Shanghai collapsed after about a year. I think there were some others, one in India, that haven't done well. So you would expect the art fairs to feel the heat post 2008, probably more quickly. Gallerists can't afford to travel, not selling anything, all of those sorts of effects. I think that's probably one of the things that happened in 2011, 2012 too. But the art fair took a much bigger hit than the Biennale circuit did.
Yeah. So I think it's a guess really, but whether the Venice, for instance, or Lyon or Istanbul, actually Lyon and Istanbul may, but Venice, I would be pleasantly surprised if they did have a sort of curated section that dealt with 2008 and what happened after. And I would like it. I think individual works one would hope they would, but overall, it would be just as expected if they just ignored the idea completely.
But that comes back to then one of the issues that we started talking about at the beginning, which was the relevance of these exhibitions. If you get something as literally earth-shattering as things like the global financial crisis, the Arab Spring, what is the future? Really, what is the future of the world? Given the financial crisis that's happening in America, those kinds of things, they get completely ignored in these large survey shows. So it just makes me wonder if there is if they're just becoming more isolated in their curatorial.
I think so, and I also think the analogy I've always used in thinking about art fairs and biennales is that the biennale is the mall and the art fair is the factory outlet. I mean, I might have stolen that from you, Dave. But,
No. I'm going to steal it from you.
Okay, good. But what that is ignorant of is the fact that everyone's doing online shopping, and
Exactly.
I think that's what we're probably witnessing in the artwork. We're still focused on the Biennale and the art fair, and wondering how they're struggling or whatever. But you're forgetting the online shopping, and I think that's where most of visual culture is actually being enacted and played out, and is relevant and contemporary.
And it can only become more so. You'd have to figure.
Portraits are coming back in 2030 in a big way.
Get your portraits here. Get
I
your
reckon
portraits
horse
here.
painting. George Stubbs is going to.
The last Venice had a lot of interesting works that dealt with precisely the confusion of engaging art in the modern world. There was a painter in the in a Dutch pavilion, and she was painting on glass over newsreel video footage. And of course, the point is she couldn't capture it. And so she painted on glass, that was videoed, and then the painting she produced was shown, and just a chaotic mess of lines. And it was all about how the artist simply cannot keep up. The present is moving too fast, it's too confusing, changes are too fast. And the artist simply, was confused in the middle of that. And I thought there were enough works in the last Venice to make that the unstated, because it was never planned, theme of the Biennale. And it was interesting for that reason.
Which I think is still running an argument about a an old school model of what we say an artist is. Like when you say that the
So
artist
it's a
can't
barometer,
conceive, well, can't keep up with it now. Well, the computer programmer can. I mean, they're the ones that are doing and running all this stuff. So I think that we are also seeing a dramatic shift in how eventually we're going to be defining the artist and looking at what great artists we're producing in the last 10 years.
There's going to be a whole heap of unplayed, unwatched video art.
Well, 2012 is this is probably completely bullshit statistic, but 2012 was also the year where there are more images produced that will never be seen by anyone than are actually being seen, because you have spam email that you never open. These images get sent around the world all the time.
I think I read somewhere recently that I think it's 60 hours per minute is uploaded into YouTube.
And that's stuff that's actually people are uploading. I mean, there are computer programs that are designed to send stuff out that no human has any intervention into.
So YouTube's going to be big in 2030.
Watch our site. What?
Yes.
Kit.com.
Where's my card? Damn.
Cards
Who
are
would
so
dare
old
say
school.
we were falling behind in this?
What is that? Is that a camera?
Well, one of the unstated things here, again, it gets back to a fairly fundamental analysis, Marxist analysis, is that the distinction between the high art world, the world we're talking about, of biennales and so on, and the distinction between the visual culture that so many people embrace, which is street art, online stuff, is a class battle.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's gender as well, certainly, but it's about class. And the deep dark secret, I think, of the art world has always been the kind of snobbish pretense that what was really just manufacturing intellectual capital was somehow manufacturing philosophy and high-minded ideas at a level that couldn't be done by popular culture. And I think the proliferation of images and information now on the web has shown us that that simply not only is not now true, it was presumably never true.
And of course, with biennales, I mean, the unstated is the same, that whoever can afford to go there to the Hajj, to these big sort of events, is the only person who can participate in the exchange of ideas, and everyone else is just excluded.
That's us guys.
Well, I know. Well,
That's the other unstated. Yes.
This is one of the
Middle class speaks.
This is one of the things that I felt going to Documenta. I hadn't been to a Documenta before.
Oh!
I know. I called myself a senior lecturer. I hadn't been to a Documenta before, and it was interesting going to. I mean, it only happens every 5 years. I think I was actually working for the government 5 years ago, so I've only gone for it. And it was very similar, I thought, to a pilgrimage. I was only there in the second week, so it was kind of fairly early on. It was actually the week where it pissed down so royally that a lot of the outside works were just inaccessible.
It always does that sometime during the
I mean, it's European summer, isn't it? But yeah, what was the point I was getting to?
Hajj.
Oh yeah. It felt like a pilgrimage. Now the feeling that I got as well is that it was kind of joyless. The experience was sort of joyless. I know we don't really call it an art festival, but there's meant to be, I think, a kind of almost a festival approach to it. And when you looked around Castle, you could tell the locals. It's a fairly kind of it's a very working class kind of town. And then you could see the visitors, the guys like us, rubbing their chins, and but there was a great deal of help me out here. You know what I'm saying, don't you?
Apathy?
Ennui?
No, that kind of.
Ennui.
When I say it, you say it again. No.
No, you know what your
used
problem was? You went on your own. I invited you. Should have come with us. We had a great time.
That's the difference I was thinking when you were saying that.
Yeah.
That looking at art, any kind of art, is not best experienced as a solitary activity.
Yeah.
I went with Euros and Jill, and we had a ball. We loved it because you're talking all the time in front of the world.
Oh yeah, no, I did go with.
About it. That's different.
Well, I actually went with Loretta, and she's not an art person.
Yeah.
She's a corporate trainer, so she's in an entirely different kind of world. And we actually found it really interesting going with her, with getting the perspective of someone who doesn't you know, she's basically part of that constituency of people who would go there, not knowing a lot about art, but you know, might be kind of generally interested. So it was interesting, and in fact, we actually. What I suppose what I'm saying is that we actually, between us, actually had a lot of fun as well. But it seemed to me that there was a lot of people from, you know, Switzerland, Germany, France, the UK who looked miserable.
But the Proms and Swiss never have fun.
Yeah.
It could be a football match, you know.
I don't know. Anyway, it's just an observation.
But I think the true relational dimension of art is precisely the conversations and arguments you have with other people in front of the work when you're moving around.
Absolutely.
That's what we found.
Absolutely.
When we went.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a low affect sort of sensibility, you know, very kind of, you know, serious approach that a lot of people within the art world have towards art, and I just
Cool. To be cool.
I don't
Detached.
know what it is,
But-
but I just find I don't identify with that, and I see it so much when I go to places like Documentary.
And I think maybe you had it there when you're talking about it being a kind of pilgrimage, a kind of religious pilgrimage, because I think that what I see a lot of in art, and I don't really get, is the high level of performance that seems necessary in order to believe in art. And it's the same with art theory. Let's be totally honest. You get this same thing at conferences, where people go because they feel like they have to go, like you have to go to church on Sunday. No one really understands why they're there or what they should be performing. What are the right rituals? What are
So it's a
the codes.
defense mechanism.
It's a kind of defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Whereas if you actually go with a team and you know you actually don't really care that much and you talk openly and honestly, there's a minority of people who are actually even willing to do that in the art world. Because I agree. I think there is a lot of art that requires a sort of religious belief because, as we would probably all agree, there's only a very small minority of art that we like, and that's okay. I'm happy to call 99% of it bullshit, but that's fine because that's what cultural products are. But I think for a lot of people, you have to invest in this whole idea of Documenta being the show of art that it has to be good.
Suspension of belief.
There was this amazing work. It was one of my favourites, a Documenta, which nobody spent any time in the room. It was overlooked. It was by Cyril Floyer, a very good artist anyway. And it was simply a white room. And you walked in, and there was a little white speaker box down the corner. And she'd sung an extract from a Tammy Wynette tune and put it on a loop. And it went, I'm going to keep on till I get it right. I'm going to keep on. And there was nothing in the room except that little plaintive tone. And I spent a lot of time in there, and it wasn't visually stunning work. There wasn't much going on, but it became totally obsessively kind of absorbing in that repetition. And the danger with a huge art show is you never have enough time to spare to find out whether the work you're looking at might reveal itself in that way.
He had enough time for that one because he sang that for like an hour.
Yeah.
And our band now covers that.
Which you can find on their Facebook page.
Suicide Watch.
All right, folks, should we wind it up?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Urosh. And it's been a pleasure.
Bye, guys.
Likewise.